Hi, I'm Bryce Crittenden.
Caroline Land, and welcome back to EPL's Overdue Finds.
Caroline, how are you today?
Doing really well, Bryce. We've got a lovely spring day happening. It's been so great to have some warmer temperatures, blue skies. It just makes everything seem a little brighter.
It does. And speaking of things being a little bit more brighter, we're actually recording this on March 15th. It's also the first day that we have customers can come back into the branches. So Caroline, we were just talking a little bit off air that when we're recording this, your branch has been open for like 3 hours. So what's that been like having actual customers come in? Has everybody been excited? And what's that been like?
People have been very excited to come back into the library, to browse through the shelves, to pick up their holds and say hi. And I know that staff as well, we've missed seeing customers too. So we're excited to see them and help them answer any questions they might have about their library card or things they're looking for or things they might need to print out on the computer. So we're really happy to see people back in the library branches.
Oh, that's awesome. And yeah, we're so happy that everybody's able to come back in and things, hopefully, knock on wood's, trying to slowly get back to normal somewhat. So today we've got a really fun episode for everyone. We hope everybody enjoyed our last episode. Of course, we took a look back at the year 1996 in pop culture. We had a ton of downloads for that first day that it was released, so which was awesome. So thank you so much for everybody for checking it out. And we're almost kind of continuing that talk a little bit because in 1996, and a lot of times especially in like the 90s, the movie soundtrack was huge, and we don't really see that a lot anymore. So today we're going to kind of expand on that last episode a little bit and talk about our favorite all-time movie soundtracks. And joining us today is a member of the Overdue Finds family, and she did an awesome job editing that last episode of Overdue Finds. Meg DeForest. Meg, welcome back. How are you?
I'm great. I'm really excited to talk about this. It's like one of my favorite things. I think I've talked with Caroline before that I was definitely one of those Columbia House kids back in the day who got pulled into the like pennies per CD, and those movie soundtracks were like the winning CDs to get. So pretty exciting.
Yeah, this is going to be a really fun episode. But before we get into talking about movie soundtracks, Caroline, we've got to talk about it a little bit here. Of course, March Madness is going on. By the time you hear this episode, we'll almost be done March Madness. But as we're recording this now, we had just started kind of the second round. Just some huge upsets so far. The big one, and Meg, you were maybe planning on calling me out about it, but on our preview episode, I said I thought SpongeBob SquarePants might beat Doctor Who. That did not happen at all. Like Doctor Who, the Doctor absolutely wiped the floor with SpongeBob. So I was disappointed.
That one was great. I mean, for me, maybe not for you. The other one was, I think I called you out on Twitter about this one, but Sailor Moon beating Wolverine, which I was personally very excited about, but also I thought was kind of surprising because I thought, well, Hugh Jackman gets a lot of love, and I think that spills over to Wolverine, maybe. Yeah,
that was, of course, if you've listened to our March Madness preview episode, I picked Wolverine to win the whole thing. And here, I thought Wolverine had an easy matchup in the first round up against Sailor Moon, and that just did not happen. And Meg, to be honest with you, I'm mostly familiar with Sailor Moon from like I remember I think it was a teenager maybe when it first came on YTV, and I was just like that looks stupid, that's not for me. And I knew Sailor Moon had its fan base, but I didn't think it would have been quite as strong as say Wolverine, so it did surprise me. And Caroline, how about you? What are some upsets or some results that have surprised you so far?
James Bond losing to Miss Marple was one. I have a vague memory that we might have joked about it, but that's not one that I saw coming.
No, neither did I. I mean, it's funny because I voted for James Bond, but at the end when I saw what the results were leading towards, I thought it was kind of funny myself, and I'm just like, yeah, let's let this happen. This is good.
Uncle Phil from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air had a very good showing against Michael Scott in the first round.
Yeah, that was another one too. I guess I think I was a little surprised by it. It's one of those weird ones where it was similar to the Batman and Calvin matchup. It's funny because obviously I voted for Michael Scott, but at the same time I was like, you know what? That's okay. Like Uncle Phil is this beloved TV dad, and you know what? I embrace the positivity of it.
Calvin beat Batman sounds like some Bizarro World Dewey defeats Truman headline that was on some newspaper. And then I talked about this on the episode when we previewed it, but in the matchup between David Rose and Captain Jean-Luc Picard, David Rose did win that matchup, and I was sad for Captain Picard because, as I mentioned, my captain is that captain. But I was kind of happy too, because if I had to vote against him, at least I had the winner for that matchup. So we'll see how David Rose does up against the Doctor.
Yeah, that's going to be another interesting one. Meg, which one are you going to vote for there?
I mean, I will probably stay with the Doctor, but I would not be surprised if David Rose took that one. I mean, not shockingly, the second round is going to get harder, especially with some of these more like creative choices that made it through. I think it's going to be really interesting who comes out on the end. But yeah, Doctor all the way.
Well, we'll see how the Doctor does. And actually, we've started to do this now. And so whoever the winner is of March Madness, we'll have an episode devoted to that character, that property, sometime in mid-April, probably once everything's all said and done. So if it's the Doctor, I'm in trouble because I'm not the biggest Doctor Who fan. So Meg, we might have you carry that episode.
Perfect.
So as Bryce mentioned, we are coming to the end of March Madness, but there's still some matchups. Don't forget, you can vote in 3 places for each matchup, once on Twitter, once on Instagram, and once on our website at epl.ca/podcast.
So let's share some of our own Overdue Finds that we've been enjoying since our last episode. Meg, what's caught your eye lately?
So this is another book, but kind of a different one. This is Love After the End by Joshua Whitehead. And it's a collection of short stories that are speculative fiction, but based in like indigenous queer space, basically. So it's a really cool take on sort of two-spirit discussions, and it's been reissued for 2021 sort of, and I think maybe late 2020 with the pandemic. And so really just sort of talking about what is an apocalypse or a pandemic, and like what is that for different populations. And so saying, a lot of indigenous populations have made it through this is a post-apocalyptic time for some of those communities. And so instead of sort of focusing on a negative post-apocalyptic, like we kind of joke that all the YA books now are dystopian, this series is really about utopian futures. And so I thought that was kind of a cool take on it, because I think I'm one of those people who probably before 2020 read a lot of dystopian stuff, and I was just sort of like off of it. Like, I need some good news in my reading. I can't sort of have that. And so it was really cool. I haven't read all of the short stories. The first one is about a teenager who falls in love with the avatar of an AI who is biologically a rat, but is like his avatar is another teen boy. And it's like really cool and just a different take on kind of what the world might be like in the future, and having those positive depictions of sort of two-spirit people as well, being sort of taking a part in that future. So very cool. It's Love After the End by Joshua Whitehead. I definitely recommend.
It sounds interesting. Is Joshua Whitehead, is that a Canadian author or?
Yeah, he's the editor. And he's, I believe, Cree, but there's different different people from different nations sort of represented from each of the different authors in the short stories.
Interesting take though, what you said about like the apocalypse and how really essentially Indigenous people have faced that already. So it's something I've never really thought of before, unfortunately, but yeah, you're absolutely right there. So yeah, it sounds quite good. Caroline, how about you? What have you been enjoying lately?
I recently read a newer book called When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole, and the marketing of it is describes it as Rear Window meets Get Out. So I was hooked with that idea, and it's the story of a young woman who moves back home to her family home in Brooklyn, and she notices that their neighborhood is going through a lot of gentrification and people are moving out and there's a lot of development, and she starts to kind of notice some odd patterns happening, and then people, she doesn't want to say that they go missing, but there's not always a great explanation for where they've gone, and she gets to know the guy who's moved in across the street from her, and together they start to uncover the history of the neighborhood as well as some interesting truths about who might be behind some of the developments that are happening. Everyone has secrets. Everyone is hiding something. There's a lot of really interesting race-based conflict, not in a violence kind of way, but just in a misunderstanding. Theo, the neighbor across the street, one day shows up in a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, but then that's juxtaposed against some of his behavior and attitudes towards the actual people who are in front of him in his neighborhood. And he talks about things like he keeps suggesting at times maybe they should get the police involved, and that doesn't always go over well. The chapters are interspersed with pages from a Nextdoor type app where people are describing things that they've seen in the neighborhood, and there are some, especially early on before the mystery thriller aspect of it really takes hold. There's one where one of the newer people who've moved into the neighborhood asks if anyone else has seen the suspicious men who have been hanging around this corner lot. And then someone comes in and explains that, yes, those are my sons, and they are 7 and 10 years old. So you see, and they're hanging around because they can't go past the corner because they can't be on their own, in the neighborhood. So there's, the way that language is used, the way that people's experiences are sometimes weaponized against other people. Just a lot of really interesting kind of cultural pieces tied into this thriller. So I really enjoyed it. It was the first thing I'd read by Alyssa Cole. She has written a lot of romance novels in the past. And so even though it would be tonally very different, I'm kind of interested in checking out those now. So that might be where I head next.
I've read a couple of her romances. She's really good. So that's sort of interesting to see that she did this other genre, really.
Yeah, and we definitely have. I know that there are some holds on copies within EPL, but we also have it in our hits to go section. So now that you can come back to the branches and browse again, keep an eye out for it there.
I was just going to say, so obviously it's a newer book then if it's part of the hits to go collection.
Yes, right? Yeah. I don't know if it was last year or maybe earlier this year, but definitely a recent publication. Yeah. How about you, Bryce? What have you been enjoying?
It's funny because in preparation for today's episode, I was kind of going through my old CDs and cassettes and kind of had some stuff up on my shelves and moving some things around, and had some DVDs sitting there. And I actually have on my own personal collection, I have the entire series of the Wonder Years, and which I think is just a very criminally underrated show. And I think like when it came out in the 80s originally, I think it did win in a lot of awards, but because it's not available on streaming services, I think a lot of people forget about it because it was last on the air like over 25 years ago. But nice thing is at EPL, we actually have all 6 seasons available on DVD that you can borrow. And this is a great show to binge watch. I cannot recommend it enough. So if you're not familiar with the show, The show follows the character of Kevin Arnold, who's played by Fred Savage, as he grows up in the 60s, late 60s and the early 70s. The show's actually more of a dramedy, but it does comedy so well. One of my very favorite episodes is from season 3, and it's called The Pimple. And Kevin's parents have some family friends coming to visit. They have a daughter who Kevin thinks is cute. So he's all excited that she's coming to their house. And unfortunately for him, being a teenager, he ends up getting a huge pimple on his cheek. So the whole episode is him just basically trying to get rid of this pimple. One of my favorite scenes ever, he decides to put a Band-Aid on it to go to school. And then then Winnie asks him, oh God, like, why do you have a Band-Aid on your face? And he's like, oh, I got punched. And then Kevin's friend is like, oh, right on that big pimple of yours. God, that must have hurt. So yeah, The Wonder Years is a great show. The cast is amazing. Of course, like Winnie Cooper, played by Danica McKellar, who Caroline, we just chatted a little bit about in our Hallmark Christmas movies episode. Yeah, obviously there's some episodes that are a little bit more serious in nature when we're talking about, of course, the era of the Vietnam War and everything, but it's a great kind of growing up comedy. So if you're familiar with maybe Freaks and Geeks, this is another show kind of along those same lines that you should definitely check out. Each episode's only like half an hour long. So like I said, this is a great one where you could borrow individual seasons from us and binge them over like the whole weekend. So yeah, if you haven't watched The Wonder Years yet, go out of your way to borrow it from us. All right. So let's get to why we're here today. Of course, we're talking about the best movie soundtracks. As we touched on at the top of the episode, this is kind of almost like a carryover conversation from our 1996 Pop Culture Confessions episode, because now granted, the movie soundtrack obviously was not invented in the 90s, but it seemed like movie soundtracks were like peak in the late 90s anyway. And we've had some really popular movie soundtracks, probably going back over 40 years now, probably mostly beginning with like Saturday Night Fever is probably one of like the biggest movie soundtracks of all time. So I have to ask, I guess in everybody's opinion, what made movie soundtracks so great, and why don't you think we see these compilation albums anymore, Caroline?
I want to start this conversation by acknowledging that there's a little bit about the topic that makes me feel like I'm talking about, kids today and the music achieved like perfection in the time period when I was most listening to it. But I think there is something about it. I think it's probably entwined all together with what movies are and how movies have changed a little bit as well. I think we saw through the 60s and 70s movies being more of a vision, by especially when you had the directors, the producers who really had an understanding of what they wanted the movie to be. And then as we saw in the 80s and 90s, we started to see more of those movies that had like the pop hits on the soundtrack, or somebody would be creating music for the soundtrack. Like I think you saw in Footloose or something used really effectively, like Danger Zone in Top Gun or something like that. And then I think by the time we get into the period after our 96 episode into the present day, I think the idea of how we listen to music has changed, and putting on an album isn't the default go-to anymore. Even things like shuffle changed how you were going to listen to it. So I don't think we get concept albums in the same way getting that mass market penetration. You have to very intentionally kind of seek that out. So I think movie soundtracks were great for a number of reasons, and the peak of the CD really allowed you to do some really interesting things with it. But I think that it was the technology that really changed it.
Yeah, I agree. I think about that time and like people who had the CD Walkmans were really big, and like that was sort of the thing. And especially, I mean, I think a lot of this was bigger with young adults and teenagers. And I think about at the time, like if you really loved a movie, if you didn't have a job, you probably couldn't afford a DVD. Like DVDs were either not available or were really expensive for some movies. And so getting the CD was something that I know, like it was a way of reliving that movie experience. Like you weren't going to stream the movie again and listen to the music the way that maybe like, again, we don't want to be like kids today, but like today, the experience of a movie, if you miss that, you could probably just be like, I'm just going to watch that movie again because I have that feeling. Whereas I feel like there was something to be said for like the feeling that a soundtrack gave you, and that you could sort of experience the feeling of that movie that maybe meant a lot to you, or the characters really spoke to you by having that CD experience.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because yeah, I remember, and I would do this with cassettes as well, where you would buy it, and of course you come home and with the CD too, and you open it up, you put the CD on, and that's when you also like pull out the insert. So you're looking at the cover art, or maybe it's like obviously the poster from the movie. And sometimes within like the fold out, they would have stills from the movies as well. So yeah, this is all kind of, you know, for myself growing up, you know, this is like just very in the early days of the internet. So yeah, this was a much easier way to kind of relive, I guess, favorite moments in a particular film for you. But yeah, Caroline, you're right though. I think just music today is just consumed so differently than it was, you know, 15, 20 years ago. Yeah, it's just, like you said, it's like we're in the age of shuffle. And I do not remember the last time I sat down and listened to like a full album from beginning to end.
And I think you're always going to have these shifts, thinking in the 80s of the home video market and how having things on VHS that you could rewatch over and over again in your own home changed things versus, you know, having to wait once a year to when The Wizard of Oz or It's a Wonderful Life was going to be on television. Now you can sit and you can watch it whenever you want, and you can kind of commit those things to memory. I think the 80s was where I went to when I really started seeing kind of that compilation CD, like you say, with Saturday Night Fever in the late 70s. But you're still kind of getting this sense of it being developed with a particular vision. I mean, even just like the amount of Bee Gees on that album. But by the time you get to something like Fast Times at Ridgemont High in the early 80s, it's clear it's just music that's being chosen kind of for a vibe rather than any one particular artist.
I really like that too. I think when we talk about maybe why they were so popular, it was like, I think about like what Bryce was saying, and there not being an internet, like you weren't going to find like it was harder to find a new artist maybe if they weren't on the radio or you didn't hear them. And so I do think of compilations as a way and soundtracks as a part of that, where you would hear a new band that was maybe similar to a band you really loved or had that vibe. Or like I can think of some movies that were like the teen summer romance, and then they had like all of those kind of teen love songs that were, or the big summer hits that were going to come out that year. And so there was something about that kind of got that vibe and got you maybe listening to somebody who you wouldn't have bought a whole CD of their songs until you knew them, and you'd sort of listen to them 700 times on that CD. And then you were like, oh, okay, yeah, this is somebody I'm going to go after, when you didn't have like Spotify or streaming music to sort of say, who is this band? Like, what are they about?
Yeah, no YouTube either.
No. TikTok dances, not happening.
I think an interesting piece of that is the music from and inspired by. And you would get that sometimes if there was like a second volume, a second soundtrack put out, that I believe they did this with Dirty Dancing. movie that was music that was not featured at all in the movie, but it's just like of that era, of that sound. It has that vibe happening. And so I remember the first time I came across something like that and felt kind of taken in by it. And then ever since then, peering a little bit closer to make sure it had the music that I wanted it on there. But we've talked a little bit about these different eras, the technology piece. When it comes to a movie soundtrack, what makes a good movie soundtrack? Meg?
Oh, it's so tough. I think it's sort of what we were talking about. It brings you back to that feeling of the movie or a character, or even just like what you were saying, Caroline, about maybe it's not even in the movie, but it has that feeling of the movie. Like, I think that there's something about a good movie soundtrack that has that emotional reaction. And then also, as Bryce was sort of saying, like, it's something that you're going to listen to all the way through. So it has that like really intentional way that it's put together that sort of leads you through one song to the next. And it's a little more thought out than just what your shuffle is going to put you through when you're listening to songs. So I think that those were some really key features of it, is just kind of having that feeling.
You touched on it a little while ago when you're talking about kind of like getting like the vibe of a movie. And first person, I guess, or first set of movies I really remember getting that from was like from Quentin Tarantino. So the Reservoir Dogs soundtrack, I remember getting, I had it on cassette in the mid 90s, shortly after the movie came out. And, there's music on there I had never heard of before that were obviously, a lot of these bands were like one hit wonders in the 70s. And I was listening to these for the first time, and I didn't ever hear these bands on the radio. They didn't have videos on much music at the time. So, and then you listen to that album, and for a lot of Quentin Tarantino soundtracks, starting with Reservoir Dogs, and actually one of my all-time favorite soundtracks is the one from Jackie Brown. And what he'll do too is like there'll be a little bit of music that you'll recognize from the movie, and then there'll be like he'll throw in a little bit of dialogue too between songs, and just kind of gives you the whole vibe of his movies. And yeah, he does, to me, he's like the master of the movie soundtrack. I'm sure he works with other very talented people to put those together, but that's one of the things that I look for anyway, that makes a good movie soundtrack, is just kind of, it just brings you back to that movie. And Caroline, I have to mention, it's funny because I totally forgot about it until you brought it up there, with these soundtracks having like the second volume coming out. I've got two in my collection at home here. So one is the soundtrack from The Wedding Singer. So that, of course, has a ton of great 80s music, and then it must have been a big bestseller, and then they released a second volume. The other was, believe it or not, Boogie Nights. Boogie Nights has a great soundtrack too, of a lot of like 70s funk and pop and everything. And that was another one where obviously the first album sold really good because we got a second volume of the Boogie Nights soundtrack, believe it or not.
Oh, one of the things, or a couple things I want to pick up on there. One of them is music that was music videos, and you would have these songs that were written directly for a movie, and then you would see their music video, and it would often have like scenes from the movie interspersed, and they didn't always make sense, or the actors from it there. Like I remember Austin Powers, Michael Myers as Austin Powers being in the Beautiful Stranger by Madonna video, and it's you'll see, I guess every now and then I catch one if I'm on YouTube or something, and I'll just remember like, oh, right. Like this is what it used to be like.
Michelle Pfeiffer is in the Gangster Paradise video because it was a Dangerous Minds tie-in. And I don't know why I was recently watching that video, and I was like, oh, right, that's what was going on. Because I'm like, why is Michelle Pfeiffer in this video? Like, it makes no sense. But yeah, at the time.
One of the things that I think makes for a good movie soundtrack is having that interplay, as you said, Meg, between the story and the music. And sometimes that can come with the chosen songs, like in a Tarantino movie where there's such care being done. Like, it is not he's probably not putting in music because he thinks it's going to sell well. He's putting it in because he's using his deep encyclopedic knowledge of pop culture to know exactly right for what character. And an example of this that's come up recently has been the music in WandaVision, which is not technically a movie, but a TV series on Disney Plus. And each episode of WandaVision had a different theme song that was interwoven with the music of the rest of the episode. And I don't want to give too much away because you really have to see the series and experience it, but hearing the composers, who were Kristen Anderson Lopez and Robert Lopez, who you might know from such things as Frozen, hearing them talk about how they use like recurring musical themes as well as music from different eras, it's that interplay, that idea of something that is specific, and it doesn't need to be original. In this case, they're original creations that were made for the show, but it could also be that compilation style, but there's a specificity and a deliberateness to what's being chosen for the story and the characters.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there's sort of those two streams. There's the like director's vision, and maybe they're using the music to evoke that era, or they have that specific song that they're thinking of, and it's really not about marketing. And then I think of like the whole stream of like some of the ones I love, which are like 10 Things I Hate About You, or Can't Hardly Wait, or Empire Records. Some of those like teen movies where, again, I think the music was being chosen very specifically, but I think was being chosen perhaps with maybe more of a marketing and of the moment mindset of like, this is a big band right now, this is who the kids are listening to, and so we're going to try to either pick that person or pick the next big thing, the like band that hasn't quite made it but we think is the one that's coming, like the stuff like that. And so I do think that there's sort of those two streams, again, being picked very deliberately in both cases, but maybe for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been really interesting to kind of, I guess, sit in, if you're a marketing executive at a studio and you're promoting, this big movie that's coming out, and, you kind of have to think like, yeah, there must have been some really interesting conversations going on with different agents, trying to get maybe some upcoming bands, or like, I think of, for example, like the Twister soundtrack. Like, it has this odd mixture of, there's Shania Twain's on it, Van Halen's on it. So like at some point somebody had to reach out to these people who are like, hey, we have a movie coming out next summer. It's about a big tornado. Can you maybe sing a song for us on there? So yeah, there must have been some really interesting conversations going on.
You hear really great stories too about studios or directors reaching out to artists and then sending them a copy of a wrong movie, and sometimes the actor, the musician coming back going, I don't think I'm right for this, and then they have to figure out where the communication broke down.
So there's some great movie soundtracks that just feature scores. So do any of you have any favorite film scores or soundtracks like this that you can recommend?
Yes. In addition to WandaVision, which I just mentioned, and is available through Hoopla, we will have links to that in our episode item list. The first composer that comes to mind is John Williams. Just the breadth of his work. If he just had the music of Star Wars, that would be a successful career. And that's just item one on his entire history. And then also I thought of the music of Nino Rota, who specifically I think probably most people know from The Godfather, kind of haunting music of The Godfather, but he also did the music for La Strada, which is a Fellini film, and he worked quite a lot with Federico Fellini, as well as Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet. So a different Romeo and Juliet than we talked about in our last episode. But as a soundtrack, I think, just as beautiful and in a very different way. And so his work too, as I was looking through his credits, there are a lot of those kind of music scores that really stand out. For me, I often have to go back to the 70s and earlier to really find the ones that were in their heyday.
Meg, how about you?
I'm gonna have to echo Caroline. I'll out myself as a giant band geek in high school. Like, I played the bass clarinet in the high school band, and on good days we got to play John Williams scores as like a treat when we like did well on our other music. It was like the big day. So yeah, I mean, Indiana Jones, Jurassic Park, like so much of that has really great sweeping music to play, which is kind of a fun thing to do. As somebody who listens to scores too, I think one of the more recent ones that I really like is Star Trek Into Darkness. It has like a really good atmosphere. I think, again, talking about directors who sort of think about music, I think J.J. Abrams is probably one of those directors who thinks about what he wants things to have as a feeling. And so definitely Into Darkness has some of those sweeping feelings that bring you back to those Star Trek themes of the 70s, but also kind of takes it into the future and has some different feels to it. And I think obviously the classic is also like the Lord of the Rings ones have really great, if you're looking for more of that folk kind of inspired, and just maybe some of us aren't outside as much as we want to or traveling as much. And definitely Lord of the Rings has that kind of, as my husband says, that whole movie, even the trees walk. So it's a lot of walking. And if you want some walking music, maybe check that out.
I was gonna say, like, I never thought of it before, but yeah, that would be perfect music. Like, if you're going down into like the river valley or something,
yep,
throw on some Lord of the Rings. I might have to try that next time.
Hot tips.
A couple for me that really stand out. Ones that I have in my own collection that I really enjoy. One of my all-time favorite movie soundtracks is from the 1979 film The Warriors. Two tracks I love from that soundtrack were composed by Barry Days Zorvon, are the theme from The Warriors and the Baseball Furies Chase. So if you're not familiar with the movie The Warriors, takes place in like New York City, late 70s. One street gang basically has to get from one end of New York to the other while dodging all these other gangs in the process. And it's a great movie, and just the music from the soundtrack and the score, it really kind of takes you back and kind of helps you revisit some of those great moments from that movie. And by the way, that movie itself is an overdue find. So if you're
Warriors, won't you come out and play?
Exactly. So good. Meg, have you seen that movie?
Oh yeah, it's one of my husband's favorite movies. So I've watched it a lot. Yeah, but
nice.
It's good.
Another one too that really stands out for me is the score from RoboCop, which features the music from Basil Polidoris, and the score itself is kind of this combination of like synthesizers and orchestral music. So you kind of get a little bit of both worlds in it. So yeah, the theme from RoboCop. I'm a huge fan of the movie, obviously, but that theme for me is kind of one of those lesser known kind of gems that you should definitely go out and listen to. And speaking of kind of synthesizers, movie director John Carpenter, so think of like The Thing and They Live. We actually, through Hoopla, have a couple of his kind of, he does a lot of the scores for his own movies. So if you watch something, say like Escape from New York or The Thing, that's him kind of composing that music. And there is a lot of synthesizers in it. So it does take you back to like the 80s a little bit, but it's definitely unique and is something a little bit different than obviously what you're getting with, say, like a John Williams or other, really big Hollywood composers. Speaking
of really big Hollywood composers, another one who's had a really great career is Alan Silvestri. I believe he did the Back to the Future theme. I think that's him. Yes. He has also been involved with the MCU and Avengers. I am on record as not being the biggest fan of Endgame. I will give it where it is due. The song Portals on the Endgame soundtrack. The combination of visuals and music is stunning. And the idea of the entire 20 whatever movie history building to that moment, I will give them that. I won't say too much else about the scene. It's probably the best one in the entire movie, but the music does it incredibly well in that moment. Stand out. We've named a lot of movies. We've named a lot of different things that we are looking for when it comes to a soundtrack. Overall, what are your favorite movie soundtracks?
One I haven't mentioned is A Knight's Tale. I think has a really good soundtrack for, again, our younger listeners who may not remember this. It was a Heath Ledger movie where he is sort of pretending as a person who's low class to be a high class person so he can be a knight. But the sort of conceit is that instead of being like the 1680s or whatever, it's the 1880s as far as the music is concerned. So there's like Heart, and there's some really just great 80s pop songs and rock songs happening while they're all in like retelling the Canterbury Tales. And again, tie into WandaVision, Paul Bettany is in Knight's Tale, which I don't think people realize. So that's definitely one of my favorites. And then, as I've sort of said, a couple of the teen ones, like I really loved Empire Records. They have another great soundtrack, again, of that kind of moment in time of these like teens working in a record store, listening to really great music of the day, but also some great hits from years past.
I think for some of mine, it's funny, I'm going to bring up Empire Records in a little bit here, but I won't touch on it now. Couple that really stand out for me. One, it's a recent one, and I think it kind of did bring back the idea of, conversations about movie soundtracks, was the first Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack is fantastic. We hadn't seen a soundtrack like that really since probably the late 90s, but here's a collection of essentially this awesome mixtape that you see referenced in the movie. So you're getting some great songs like Hooked on a Feeling and Go All the Way by the Raspberries, which is a fantastic song. So the first Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack is fantastic. I haven't really listened to the second one, but the first one, if you're going to start with one, that's a good one too. And another recent one too, and this movie is fantastic. I don't think we'll probably ever get a sequel to it, unfortunately, but that's Edgar Wright's Baby Driver. So the soundtrack itself, I remember this is a movie that we saw it in the theater, and while I loved the movie, I think I liked the music in the movie even more. And that was kind of a rare case where I remember kind of leaving the theater and I'm on my phone on iTunes. I'm like, okay, I'm downloading this soundtrack like right now. I didn't even look to see who all was on it. Basically, the soundtrack obviously is kind of like the same kinetic energy as the movie itself. It's great music to drive to, obviously. Some of my favorite songs on that one are the song Bell Bottoms by the John Spencer Blues Explosion, and a Queen song that I was not familiar with at all called Brighton Rock. So those are a couple of recent ones, and probably my all-time favorite one is the soundtrack to the animated movie from the early 80s. It's for adults, Heavy Metal. So, of course, based on the magazine. But as somebody who loves classic rock, the Heavy Metal soundtrack that's what I'm all about. So basically we got music by Sammy Hagar. He sings the theme song Heavy Metal. And then we also got music from Devo, Cheap Trick, Journey, Grand Funk Railroad, Black Sabbath, Stevie Nicks. This is one of my favorite movie soundtracks of all time. Caroline, how about you?
The first one that came to mind for me was The Big Chill, which is a movie that I have loved for a ridiculously long time. I was into the nostalgia before I had anything in my life to be nostalgic about, like watching it, I don't know, when I was in elementary school. The plot of the movie The Big Chill is that a bunch of close friends from college have reunited for a funeral, and they spend the weekend reliving their dynamic and getting into some of the music that they had loved. It's a Motown soundtrack. I was doing some research for this, and it's something like the 5th best-selling Motown CD of all time, just because
Wow.
of the content of the music on there. But just such a in terms of capturing the vibe of a movie that was all about reliving it, really successful there. I loved the soundtrack for Almost Famous. I mentioned Fast Times at Ridgemont High earlier in the episode. Both were Cameron Crowe involvements, and very similar. As a music journalist, he was instrumental in, no pun intended, picking out the songs that were going to be featured in the movie and had connections with many of the bands that were there. Pretty in Pink was another one that I love. The Smiths' Please, Please, Please Let Me Get What I Want is featured on that. And I think that one is another case of I've definitely listened to that album more than I've watched the movie. So it's definitely hitting something when I watch it. The Graduate as another kind of like concept almost album of Simon and Garfunkel that in terms of like all-time great music soundtracks, that's definitely one. And one from a couple episodes ago that was part of maybe kicking this all off, The Bodyguard.
I have a theory that just like Jagged Little Pill, there are certain windows in time where absolutely everybody owned a certain album, and to me it's like the soundtrack to The Bodyguard and Jagged Little Pill. Like if you were alive at that time, somebody in your household had that album.
It was like breeding in people's closets. Like you wouldn't even remember buying it, but somehow you had gotten one from somebody.
Another one that I loved, and this is going back, was the soundtrack to the movie A League of Their Own. And I loved it. Again, it was early 90s, and it was one of the first CDs we had, and I just listened to it over and over, and I would make up dances in my living room, listening to like the score part of it, because there is music, but the Madonna song from that is really sad and depressing. And that's not really the vibe of the movie. So I would just put on like the triumphant montage music and just dance around the living room. And that was just, I was very happy at the time.
Oh, we didn't even get into movie montages. Like the soundtrack for montages was a whole other like genre of thing that was happening. Like you think about the Rocky movies or every movie had those montages, and like again with the score or whether it was a recognizable song. And
another thing we haven't gotten into, and I know we still have some things to talk about, but we haven't really talked about movie musicals. And so the idea, like going back to Columbia House, one of the ones we got, and I think it was just one of the random ones they sent you, and then once we had it, we just kept it. It was the theme to the soundtrack for Evita. And I've never seen that movie, but I know the music so well. Same with, I knew the soundtrack to Chicago inside and out. I've never seen it live. It was like years ahead of when the movie was out. And I know people were similar, the same way with Hamilton, knowing the soundtrack intimately before ever seeing it in person. So I don't know. I think we should probably put musicals on the list of potential future episodes.
And then there's the ones that are sort of the in-between. Like I loved The Who's Tommy for years. That was like a CD I listened to all the way through. And then eventually I saw it on stage, but like years and years after I had listened to it. And and now isn't Green Day, didn't they do American Idiots? They eventually did a musical of it, but it was again a concept album before. And so I think there were things that were maybe in that in-between zone of between a concept and a musical, and then maybe became a musical. But
so this is the question I've been really looking forward to. Meg, I'm going to start with you on this one. Is there a soundtrack that you like better than the movie?
Yeah, there's a couple. I think the one that came to mind first is the Batman and Robin soundtrack. It's one of those ones where like the movie, But the soundtrack, if you look, it's like Smashing Pumpkins, it's Bone Thugs and Harmony. Jewel, Foolish Games is on that soundtrack. The Poison Ivy song is very good from that soundtrack. Fun for Me is on there, which again, I don't remember the artist, but is a really fun song. And so, yeah, I definitely would say the music is better than the movie. Maybe a bit more controversially, a more recent one would be Suicide Squad. I think that they have a really, like, that's one that I've seen the movie once, but I've listened to that soundtrack far more often than I've watched the movie. Again, because it just has some really, really great music on it, but the movie is okay.
It's funny. I've only watched Batman and Robin once. I've talked about my love of Batman, so I tried to kind of clear that one out of my head, but I don't think I've ever checked out the album. And after you mentioned those artists, maybe I need to look that one up. Caroline, how about you?
I have Garden State with a question mark.
Oh.
And I don't know if I honestly don't know if I've seen the movie in like 15 plus years. And so it might just be some like cringe memory of it hitting like at the time in my life when it first came out. I was fairly recently starting university. It's, discovering music and getting into things and being passionate and all of that stuff. So maybe I'm just a little nervous about how I remember it. But the soundtrack, I would still put next to anything. I mean, it's where I really discovered the Shins, a lot of other music, just that kind of wistfulness of it. I will stand by the soundtrack more than I would the movie. And one that I don't know if it counts, but Purple Rain. I watched that for the first time last year, and the music is amazing. The acting is not. How about you, Bryce?
Meg, you mentioned it. Empire Records. The movie itself is just like, it's okay. But the album, the actual soundtrack, I think most people recognize that as more of a soundtrack than they do like the actual movie itself. Empire Records. And another one for me, this is going to be a controversial pick. I like the soundtrack to Saturday Night Fever way more than I do the movie itself. That movie, like I said, I've only seen it like once or maybe twice, but it just, I've never cared for it. But the soundtrack is fun and amazing to listen to. So it's a great, if you want to get like good piece of kind of disco from the late 70s, that's a perfect soundtrack to throw on.
So before we get to our roundtable questions, Bryce, can you let everyone know what we'll be chatting about on our next episode, which will be coming out on Friday, April 9th?
Yeah, Caroline, I think me and you have some homework to do with
We
this
do.
one, because this is a show that everyone's been talking about. So on the next episode, we're going to be chatting all about Bridgerton. So in addition to the show, we're also going to be chatting about the series of novels and the idea too of colorblind casting. So that's one of the things that a lot of people have been praising the show Bridgerton about. So we're going to explore that topic a little bit on that episode. So we hope you'll join us for that one. Caroline, full disclosure, I have not watched a single episode of Bridgerton, and it's something that it's not really a show that I would traditionally watch, so I am going to watch all 8 episodes by the time we record that next episode.
And speaking of really cool scores, I think when you do watch it, it's got a really interesting score too.
So our first roundtable question: congratulations! They've decided to make a movie based on your life. Which 3 artists would you insist be included on the soundtrack? Meg.
Oh, this was so tough. I had a really tough time getting this down. I think No Doubt would have to be on there. Just a Girl, all of that. Like, I had that feeling in me. Death Cab for Cutie would be another band that I really love. Again, perhaps for some a little melodramatic, but everybody has a teen years phase in your autobiography, so Death Cab can be in there. I think another one that maybe we haven't heard from for a while, Crash Test Dummies, I think would be awesome. They have some really great like Superman, all of those kinds of songs. So that's what I narrowed it down to. But it was tough. It was a tough call to do.
For mine, I kind of split mine up. So I was like, I'm thinking about, okay, if they're making a whole movie of my life, like I got to go like early years, teenager years, adult years. So I'm going with Fleetwood Mac for my childhood years. For years, my parents would always be like, I'm sure I've heard the album Rumors like hundreds upon hundreds of times. So have to have that on there. I probably have some No Doubt for the teenage, late teen, early 20s years. And then kind of working and everything, I'm going to go with some Foo Fighters, maybe. Just because I'm sure there's some newer bands I should go with, but I like the Foo Fighters, so I thought that would give me a pretty good mixture for my soundtrack. Caroline, who's on your soundtrack?
I started out with some CanCon, so Bare Naked Ladies will feature heavily. And then I think there will be some scenes where the only music that would be by Jan Arden. So she's going to be making an appearance. And then my third choice, I went with the Brian Jonestown Massacre, and specifically the song David Bowie, I Love You Since I Was 6, because that is going to be the score to a specific scene that I have had kind of like visually shot out in my head for a very long time. And to find out what that scene would be, you'll just have to watch the movie. But what upcoming movie would you like to be responsible for producing the soundtrack for? Bryce, we'll start with you.
Yeah, it's funny because I came up with the question, and then when I was doing up my notes, I was like, oh, this is hard because unlike past years, we don't really have this big calendar of what to expect. So we know of some movies that are coming out. So the one movie that's coming out in a few weeks I am like super excited for is Godzilla versus Kong. So I thought, and I'm sure they have a great soundtrack already planned for it, but if I could be put in charge of that soundtrack, it's going to be filled up with some like heavy metal and classic rock and just kind of fit the vibe of the trailers that I've seen for it.
Meg, how about you?
I think it would have to be Mortal Kombat, which is coming out. And I think, again, going back to movies and soundtracks that maybe are mismatched, the old Mortal Kombat's is a great soundtrack. Again, the movie, meh. But I would definitely, like, there's just some things that have to be on there. You have to scream Mortal Kombat at least like 5 times more than somebody thinks you should.
Meg, I recently went back and watched the original Mortal Kombat movie from 95. And I remember that being one of the only movies based on a video game that I was like, that's actually pretty good. But anyway, I went back and watched it and I was like, I hope the new Mortal Kombat movie's better because this does not hold up. But I will admit that soundtrack is awesome.
For my movies, I was torn, and I don't. Maybe you guys can help me out here because I was thinking either Respect, which is an Aretha Franklin biography that's coming out later this year, starring Jennifer Hudson. I think you could do some cool things with that, or Space Jam: A New Legacy. And I think in that one you kind of go with like jock jams meets like a little bit of comedy meets dance party.
Yeah, that's actually, it's funny because Aretha will be a fantastic movie, but you'll be limited to what music you can select for it, obviously. Whereas Space Jam, you'll be able to have way more fun with it, I think. Throw in some jock jams and maybe it's like LeBron James is rapping in a song. Who knows? Yeah. But that would be my pick.
Then I will go with Space Jam: A New Legacy. Thank you so much for joining us today, Meg. This has been so much fun talking about these movies and songs. Are there any upcoming life skills classes that listeners should know about?
Yeah, we've got some great sustainable kitchen classes coming up, including one on meal planning and making pretzels and Greek donuts, and even some on some changes to waste management at the city with the new garbage bins and things like that, and composting. And so if you want to learn more about that, we're kind of crossing our fingers that spring is here to stay, and so you may want to learn a little bit more about yard waste and that sort of stuff. Dates and times are definitely up on our website, and I'm sure we'll get them in the show notes, so definitely check those out.
Great. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you're subscribed so that you automatically get all of our new episodes. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We love getting reviews, and we love hearing from listeners. If you like what you hear, please tell a friend about the show.
Yeah, and of course, as we mentioned already, we'll have a link to everything that we've talked about in today's show notes. And if you want to share some of your personal favorite movie soundtracks with us, email us at podcast@epl.ca or hit us up on Twitter by using the hashtag EPL Overdue Finds. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.